Hi everybody, this is lecture 5. We've got the second multiplication of loaves. We've got Peter's confession of faith and the start of the second half of the gospel, which begins with the great journey narrative to Jerusalem. Chapters 8 and chapter 9 verses 1 to 32. You might remember that in the last lecture we looked at the first miraculous feeding of 5,000 people in the wilderness. And that was followed by Jesus' confrontation with Jewish authorities over the rules for eating. And it ended with the healing of the deaf and partially dumb man. Our first section in today's lecture repeats this pattern. We have the miraculous feeding of 4,000, chapters 8, verses 1 to 10. We have a confrontation with the Pharisees over their need to ask for a sign, verses 11 to 21. And we have the healing of the blind man near Bethsaida, verses 22 to 26. Then we move into a second section of today's lecture, the central moment in our story of Mark's Gospel really, where Peter finally is able to confess and acknowledge Jesus as Messiah, verses 27 to 30. And then Jesus dramatically qualifies this confession by talking about the Messiah has got to suffer and die, the role of suffering in his life and in our lives. And then he begins the journey to Jerusalem. This is third chapter, verses 34 to 38. We've entered the second part of the whole gospel here. And the third section deepens this new turn by looking at the Transfiguration, chapter 9, verses 1 to 13, the healing exorcism of the possessed boy, verses 14 to 19, and the second passion prediction, chapter 9. We end at verse 32. So the first of three sections is the second multiplication of the loaves and fishes and the aftermath. We look at the story briefly now of the multiplication of loaves for 4,000 people. This is a replay of the miraculous feeding of 5,000, obviously. It has all the same Exodus and Eucharistic themes, but it occurs in Gentile territory. And so Mark is probably telling us that Jesus has come not just for the Jewish people, but also for the Gentiles. This Gentile emphasis is reinforced by Jesus telling that, is reinforced rather by Mark telling us that many have travelled a long distance, obviously from pagan territories elsewhere, whilst the number 4 in the 4,000 suggests perhaps the four corners of the world. And the type of basket spoken of that collects the scraps left over is a lovely Greek sort of basket, much more elegant than the Jewish wicker basket of the feeding of the 5,000. The next section. The Pharisees ask for a sign. In John's account of the multiplication of loaves and fish, the people, seeing the sign that he'd given, said, "This is the prophet come into the world." In Matthew, when the Pharisees ask for a sign, Jesus goes on to say, "This is the wicked and faithless generation and asks for a sign. The only sign it will be given is the sign of Jonah." The ordinary people in John read the sign of the multiplication of loaves very well. But in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, the religious leaders and even the disciples don't read the sign. Historically speaking, it was important for prophets to have their authority confirmed in some way by some special sign. But it's obvious in the way Mark's presenting it that unless our hearts are open, we won't be able to read that sign. When the Jews were in the desert, they began to murmur too against Moses and against God. And they were called a wicked generation. In the church's office, we begin each day with the invitatory psalm. We can use a couple of alternatives, but the main invitatory psalm, the main call to prayer, has these words: "Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, as on that day at Massah in the desert, when your fathers put me to the test. For 40 years that generation repelled me." And we recall that when the Jews, the Pharisees, asked Jesus for a sign. And Jesus says this is a wicked generation. Just interestingly, St. Paul is to say in 1 Corinthians, it's the Jews that ask for a sign. And the Greeks ask for wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified. So all this business of asking for a sign is fascinating. And it sort of is telling us here, in Mark's understanding of it, that the poorer ones see it more than the religious authorities or the disciples. You might have noticed too that this asking for a sign takes place in the district of Dalmanutha. We haven't got a clue where that is, it seems. Jesus has just arrived by boat, and then after this scene happens, he gets back into a boat and he goes off to the other side. En route, Jesus has a conversation with the apostles, and his exasperation with them occurs. He tries to talk about the dangers of the Pharisees and the Herodians, but the disciples, of course, misinterpret that. And this leads Jesus into a lot of questions about their inability to get what he's on about. Is the heart of all of you still hardened? Do you have eyes and not really see, ears and not really hear? He then goes on and reminds them of the healing miracles, ending with, and still you don't grasp what's happened. So as we come pretty well now to the end of the first half of Mark's Gospel, it's abundantly clear that the disciples fundamentally are still quite blind. They don't see who Jesus really is, and they don't really get what he's on about. In many ways, this is the climax of the first half of the Gospel. And then the next scene is the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. A number of scripture writers see this scene as the start of the crucial section of Mark, and it's serving as a bookend with another healing of a blind man, Bartimaeus, and it encases when Jesus is talking about the cross and the resurrection, what Jesus truly is on about, and how suffering is part of that. And that occurs at the end of this journey towards Jerusalem, the journey narrative. Certainly, this scene of the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida functions as a bridge between the first half of the Gospel set mainly in Galilee and the surrounding pagan lands, and the second half, which starts with this journey to Jerusalem. Then again, we can view it slightly differently as the culmination of the first half of the gospel, we see it from this perspective as reinforcing the healing story of the deaf and partially dumb man, which we've just seen last week. And they are so similar, these two stories. Jesus puts his own saliva on the sense that needs to be healed, and in each case, the Lord's touch seems vital. So these two healing stories, found only in St. Mark, perhaps because they're a bit too graphic for Matthew and Luke, perhaps are connected too. We notice that the healing occurs, this healing at Bethsaida, in two stages. Perhaps to remind us that we really only gradually come to faith. Our sight is only gradually, the eyes of faith are only gradually opened. Okay, that's the first big section. The second big section we now enter now, and it's Peter's confession of faith and the start of the journey towards Jerusalem. It's only a few verses, chapter 8, verses 27 to 38. But it's a couple of key, short scenes. The first is Peter's confession of Jesus as Messiah, chapter 8, verses 27 to 33. And this scene is deliberately set way up north of the Holy Land, at a place called Caesarea Philippi. It's the northernmost tip of the Holy Land, at the foot of the great Mount Hermon. It's called Banyas today, a word that comes from Panias, a place sacred to the pagan god Pan. There's a cave there, from which flows a spring of water, which is one of the main sources of the river Jordan. So it's always had a sacred feel about it. And then Herod built a white marble temple there, and his son Philip built a city there, and it became his capital city. The scene is set while Jesus and the disciples are on the way to Jerusalem. A new profound narrative and theme. While we have known from the beginning of the gospel the true identity of Jesus, in a sense, the first half of the gospel has been enticing us to look at who Jesus really is. Who is this man that even the wind and the sea obey him? We know that the disciples have only a sort of a fuzzy half idea of who he is, and they often misread what he does. Now Jesus asks them very directly, "Who do people say I am? And you, who do you say I am?" Their answer to the first question is, well, John the Baptist, and some say you're Elijah. Some people say you're one of the prophets. And we can't help but think of John the Baptist himself, because that's what people were saying John the Baptist was. And if you might remember, that was Herod Antipas's question about the Baptist. But then, of course, comes that great question, which we all love, and we all have to answer in our own way. But you, who do you say I am? We can all hear Jesus asking us that, can't we? We don't want to give a catechism answer. The Lord wants us, from our own experience of life, to say it, what we think he is. Peter answers quite well, really. You are the Messiah. You are the anointed one. You are the one that the Jewish people have been waiting for. This is the first time we've heard the word Messiah, Christos, in the text of the gospel itself. It's featured as the reason Jesus was executed by the Romans, because he's the King of the Jews, the Messiah of the Jews. He's a political leader, they say. However, in this scene, Jesus sort of doesn't stay with the word Messiah so much, because it is a political term, and it's got a number of different connotations which he doesn't like, because what he wants to say is that, yes, you can call me that, but this Messiah has to suffer and die. And so he immediately sets about talking about that. He explains the type of Messiah that he's called to be. But for the disciples, they couldn't get how a Jewish Messiah could die shamefully on a cross. And this first passion prediction that happens, they saw as utter folly, utter stupidity. Peter says, no, Lord. But Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, because the way you think is man's way, not God's. Peter just didn't understand this destiny Jesus had to fulfill. God's understanding of suffering is so different from ours. In many ways, this scene is so central to how we interpret the suffering in our lives. We end up hoping and praying that all suffering does have some meaning, some redemptive value in the loving plan of God. We move immediately into the next scene, the way of discipleship, verses 34 to 38 of chapter 8. This is fundamental stuff, what being a disciple is. We're called to deny ourselves, it says. We've got to put our following of Jesus above the other commitments and plans of our lives. We're asked also to carry our cross, being ready to follow Jesus along any pathway to Calvary that may happen to be ours. Brendan Burns says, in the world of Mark's Gospel, where crucifixion was all too familiar, such language would have had a chilling resonance. And then we have those extraordinary verses which speak of losing and saving our life, our soul, the Greek word psyche, our deeper self. There's a play here between our false self and our true self, which is, of course, something all the great religious prophets and teachers speak about. Jesus has an extraordinary respect for each human being, and that their true self may blossom, knowing only too well, of course, that frequently we're trapped in our false self, our false sense of what's going to make us happy, what's going to fulfill us in life. And the final verse reminds us that those who are trapped in the values of this adulterous and sinful generation, who are ashamed of Jesus and the gospel, will find that the Lord is ashamed of them when the end times come. So that's the heart, as Mark sees it, of the gospel. And now we we move in our journey towards Jerusalem further now, and the third main section of today's lecture is the Transfiguration and its aftermath, and it includes the second Passion prediction. We're into chapter 9, verses 1 to 50. The Transfiguration and its aftermath. It's chapter 9, verses 1 to 32, pardon me. So first off, the Transfiguration and its aftermath. We're chapter 9, verses 1 to 13. Again, if I can speak about Brendan Byrne, he tells us that this scene is a midway scene in the story. It's the second of three scenes where Jesus is proclaimed Son of God. The first was at his baptism. The second is here, right at the beginning of the journey to Jerusalem. And the third will be as he dies upon the cross. Each scene follows a commitment by Jesus to enter, as Brendan Byrne says, the human condition fully, completely. The human condition which is distant from God. The Transfiguration is that revelation of who Jesus truly is to his closest companions, Peter, James and John. And this is at the critical juncture of when his journey to Jerusalem starts. And he's explained to them what the Messiah is destined to do, to suffer and die. The Transfiguration is a confirmation, really, of who Jesus is, and it's an anticipation of what will take place after his death. Despite all the suffering that Jesus and his disciples will face, this scene gives us some idea of our ultimate destiny, a glimpse, in a sense, of the true reality of life that's happening, even in the midst of suffering. In a sense, that's how God sees life. It's a theophany in the midst of life. Mark says, we can't help but think of Moses on Mount Sinai for this scene. Moses climbs Mount Sinai to meet God as Jesus takes his 3 disciples, close friends, up the mountain. Clouds cover this mountain as a cloud appears here and on Mount Sinai. God speaks from the cloud, both places, Sinai and here. Moses' face becomes radiant as Jesus' clothes become radiant. And those who see Moses, those who see Jesus, are afraid. Elijah also encounters God on a holy mountain. Moses and Elijah, of course, symbolized the law, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah. The 2 major sources of revelation, the law and the prophets, as any Jewish person would understand it. And yet God says to the 3 disciples, you listen to Jesus, because his word fulfills the law and the prophets. Peter says, let's build 3 tents here. Tents suggests the Feast of Tents or Tabernacles. And that feast day celebrates God's presence among us. God's presence among us in the beauty of creation. God's presence among us in the gift of the law at Mount Sinai. And God's presence among us in the Holy Temple. We see God's presence among us in Jesus. As they come back to reality, as they come down the mountain, the three disciples discuss what rising from the dead might mean, as well we might ourselves. And Jesus responds with a question about Elijah, saying that he's already come in the form of John the Baptist, and he's prepared us for what's going to take place. And that's going to be, of course, he's prepared us for suffering and death. Okay, we move on to the next section of this last big section, the third episode, and it's the healing or exorcism of the possessed boy, verses 14 to 29 of chapter 9. The emphasis in this beautiful story is on faith and on the struggle the disciples have to really have faith. And this becomes a dominant motive in this journey narrative to Jerusalem. Michael Fallon speaks of a beautiful painting by Raphael in the Vatican of the Transfiguration. And in it there are two scenes. An upper scene where the Transfiguration takes place, and a lower scene which depicts the disciples in this particular scene we're going to be looking at, considering, it's showing us rather, that the father of this poor possessed boy imploring the apostles to do something about it, and them unable to and not responding well, etc., to the poor dad. They're obviously a bit uncomfortable. In the centre of the lower scene, with her back towards us, as we're looking at it, we see this person's back is faith. Is faith. It's rather fantastic, isn't it? Because it's faith imploring the disciples in a way to look at their own faith in Jesus. Because it's through that they will be able to help this poor dad. As the story unfolds, we can't help but think of earlier scenes in Mark. In particular, the graphic description of the boy's terrible state reminds us of the terrible state the demoniac was in chapter 5. And the almost desperate call of the dad reminds us of Jairus' desperate call to Jesus to help his little daughter. And Jesus takes this fellow by the hands and helps him up, as he did for Peter's mother-in-law and the little girl. But in the scene, what's obviously there is an emphasis on faith. When the Father tells Jesus that the disciples were unable to help, Jesus says, "You faithless generation." And then when the Father implores Jesus directly, Jesus replies, "Everything's possible to anybody who has faith." The dad says, "I do have faith. Help the little faith I have," which is our prayer always. And at the end of the story, Jesus says to the disciples privately, this kind of demon can only be driven out by prayer. And prayer is faith in action. So our focus is meant to be in this story on growing in faith. And of course, the growing in faith of who Jesus is and what's going to happen in his suffering and death. And the final scene is the passion prediction, the second one, verses 30 to 32. We're on the way to Jerusalem, and it's while they are, it says, passing through Galilee, that Jesus has this conversation with the disciples. What were we arguing about on the road, he says. And Jesus, for a second time, broadens the subject of his forthcoming passion. He instructs them again, he says, the Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men, etc. He's instructing them. He's trying to tell them that the Messiah must suffer, but he will rise again. They can't grasp this, or they won't face it. They did not understand what he said, and they were afraid to ask him. So Jesus talks to them about it, but they don't understand. I'm sure all of us have probably got in the back of our minds, did Jesus actually predict his own death and subsequent resurrection? Are these 3 passion predictions, 2 of which we've looked at, historical? Well, we could say that it's highly probable Jesus came to see that God's plan would involve his own death, because that's what happened to all the great prophets of old. Indeed, the wonderful Raymond Brown, in his magisterial study, 1994, called The Death of the Messiah, says this: in the last days of his life, Jesus would have struggled in prayer with God about how his death fitted into the inbreaking of God's kingdom. And this, in my judgment, warrants certainty. So Jesus would have known in some way that he was going to die, and in some way this was part of God's plan for him. However, the formulations that we now have in these passion predictions have been written down in the light of the passion narrative itself, which follows immediately, of course, soon after the 3 chapters of the journey to Jerusalem. Mark has constructed his story as a way of showing us how central suffering is in the life of Jesus and how central it is in our life. He shows us how hard and challenging it was and must have been for the disciples. And yet he's at pains to show us it's all part of God's plan for Jesus and for the world, for redeeming suffering. The journey to Jerusalem prepares us in a profound way, really, for the passion of Jesus. So in conclusion, chapters 8 and chapter 9, verses 1 to 32, take us from the ministry of the apostles and Jesus in Galilee and the surrounding pagan districts into a radically new phase of our story, the journey to Jerusalem, where the Lord will suffer and die. The first half of the gospel forced us really to look at who this figure of Jesus really is. Who is he? Where does he get all this wisdom from? Why is it that the wind and the sea obey him? And it's Peter who responds in a very beautiful way, you are the Messiah. But because that's filled with political overtones, Mark's focus is to tell us that this is a different type of Messiah than we think. This Messiah is going to suffer and die. And of course, we're all forced to think of the place of suffering in our own lives. The disciples, after this experience, still don't grasp it, of course. As the story of the poor little boy who's possessed shows us. Their faith is still fuzzy, it's half there, it can't cope with suffering and so on. And we finish this particular lecture by looking at the second passion prediction. Thank you.